Greetings. This is our part 2 of resurrecting a Game Plan Agents 777 pinball machine. Last time we took care of a bunch of things, got the power supply to work. Promptly it blew up, fixed it again, fixed a bunch of things on the machine, AC cords, this and that, painted the legs, which is the most important part. But turning on the machine got us nothing. I mean, we did see that the general illumination comes on, but that's just fed from the 6.3 volt AC tap from the transformer, but nothing else happened. Now on these boards, and if you've watched some previous episodes of Artifact, you see that these boards basically perform a post routine, a power on self-test, and report the results by blinking an LED, which is this one over here. And this LED doesn't blink at all. So what happened in I worked on this for probably the last 2 weeks. I just couldn't find a block of time, one contiguous block of time to work on this full blast. You know, an hour here, 2 hours there. And the video became a discombobulated, discontinuous collection of things. So I think it's better if I just discuss the results with you now instead of trying to put together the bits and pieces that I filmed days apart and couldn't even make sense out of myself. But here it is. I poked around this board a lot. I tested a bunch of things and things just weren't working. I mean, the clock was running kind of on the CPU clock, but nothing else seemed to make a whole lot of sense. So I shut things off and I started just measuring voltages. And the 5 volts was kind of in distress, even though the power supply was fixed, but it was pulling the power supply down. So I turned things off and I started measuring rail resistance, supply rail resistance, and everything seemed okay except the 5 volt rail, which showed about 20 ohms from 5 volts to ground, which obviously wasn't good. So something on this board was pulling down the 5 volt supply, and I had to find what it was. Now the first step was easy. You may notice that a lot of these chips were socketed, or are socketed. I pulled every socketed chip and tried the measured resistance on the positive 5 volt rail again, and it was still 20 ohms. So now I really had to do some hunting, and generally what happens is you have to start cutting supply pins or ground pins on the chips that are soldered in till you see the rail resistance go up. Should be around a K or more. But in this case, you know, there was, even though a large part of the chips were gone that were socketed, there still were quite a few left over that were not socketed. So what I decided to do on this one is use a divide and conquer approach, or basically do a binary search on the board to see if I could isolate the section that was causing the near short condition on the 5 volt rail. Now the divide and conquer approach is not always feasible on a board. It depends on the topology of the voltage rails, but this one lent itself to that approach nicely. As you can see, you know, there's a 5 volt rail here, and it just kind of branched out and fed different parts of the board. So what I did was I cut the trace that was coming out of the fat rail, and there's a few other places on the board I did this, till I finally found, I made another cut, and I finally found that the resistance on the rail jumped up to like 1.2K. Alright, so now I could narrow it down to a section of the board, and it turned out that this guy was a culprit. and he was a 74 LS 138. So he got removed, socketed, and changed. Everything looked good. The resistance was fine, so I plugged in all of the socketed chips back, made power connections, and nothing happened. Same thing. It wouldn't run. It still was doing all sorts of strange things, except now the 5-volt rail was up to 5 volts. It was getting the clock to go into the processor, to the Z80 over here, but it was just not. I mean, there was some activity on it. There was a lot of floating lines on it. I mean, something was still seriously wrong over here. So the next step was, okay, since I have a lot of other pinball boards, working boards that use a lot of these chips, I basically swapped chips. I made sure that the boards, the test boards I was using worked, and basically transplanted chips from here into the other working board. And I found a whole bunch of bad chips. And before musing about why that happened, is my guess is this board got zapped by high voltage. Now, if you watched the last episode, you saw that the 5-volt regulator went bad, but instead of being lethal and just outputting the 12 volts that was feeding the supply, it had just kind of dropped to 1.4 volts. 1.4 volts isn't going to hurt the chips. I mean, obviously it won't work, but it's not going to hurt the chips. But somehow this board got zapped really badly, considering that, I mean, this was bad, this, both ROMs, and this. These two small SRAMs were still good, and that was fortunate because these are kind of hard and expensive to find. But yeah, all of these, the ones I pointed out, were bad. I burnt new ROMs and got new chips, put them in, and so now things were supposed to work, right? Wrong. It still didn't work. I got a couple of blinks, which kind of told me that this SRAM, the 6810, was bad, but it had already been replaced, and it didn't make a lot of sense, but I did get some life out of it. So I tested further and further, and found more stuff. After a few days and several hours and testing things on the bench again, I found these two guys were acting funny. They're 4-bit latches, and they're hooked up to the data bus, and one of these was pulling down the data bus, the inputs. I mean, at this point I know that this board got zapped, so I was expecting to see all sorts of weird things to happen, and both of these were bad. So basically, after removing these two and replacing them, I got the 6 required blinks out of the post LED, and everything seemed to be okay. I installed the board in the machine, but it was still a disaster. The solenoid started playing melodies, and just things were going bananas. Just really bad. There was no sound, a loud hum. The lights were kind of working, but they looked erratic. So back to the bench it was for this guy. And the last thing I found was the 74 154, which is basically takes in 4 bits in and then turns 1 of 16 lines out low. I guess a demultiplexer, converter, whatever it's called, and that was sending all sorts of weird signals out to the solenoid and the lamp driver. Sound I don't know, because it was just sitting there humming along, but it looks like that fixed this board. And other than that, I put a coin cell on it, Because remember, the big part here was that somebody had gracefully removed the NiCad batteries early on. There is no battery leakage on this whatsoever, which is a real rare sight on a game plan game. But so we have that backing up, and then we finally got to the point where we stared at the post LED with great expectations, and all right. So the board's saying I'm okay now, even though before I changed this part, it gave me 6 blinks, but it can't really test this because the outputs of this don't loop back to a PIA or anything. So it doesn't know if this is working or not. I had to put it in the machine, but basically the CPU says, here I go. Here's a quick view of the body parts I had to change, and this of course is the 5-volt regulator, and not all parts I replaced are here because some of them, I mean, these all came out of sockets. This one got desoldered, but at that point I was sick and tired of trying to desolder stuff, so I cut out the other chips, just cut the legs and replaced them. So not everything is here, but this basically gives you a summary of what needed to be replaced on this board. Next I pulled the solenoid board because I'm not really going to be able to test this till I go through all the boards. I mean, I mentioned that I think the board got zapped, but I didn't talk or give my guess as to how it got zapped. And even though the 5-volt regulator failed, it failed in a non-catastrophic way. So that couldn't have hurt the board. What I think happened was somebody reconnected or played around with the connectors on the power supply. And even though I think originally they were keyed, they had like, if you look at a connector like this, it's missing a pin here, and it's got a plug in the corresponding, a little single pin plug in the corresponding plug that goes into here, preventing you from misaligning that. But most of those keying plugs that were supposed to be in the connectors were gone, especially the ones going to the power supply. So somebody just kind of plugged things in. I don't know how that happened. I guess if you force those connectors in when they're not aligned, it'll pull out the little keying plug or shove that back into the shell of the connector, and somebody got nervous with the machine and didn't have any patience, and I think just removed, or not subconsciously, but they just kind of forced connectors into place that killed the keying on them. And I think finally something got plugged into the power supply that put either 12 volts or 28 volts on the 5-volt rail. And that basically played havoc with everything. Not a whole lot on the solenoid driver. You have another 74LS154 decoder. I guess it's not a demultiplexer, but it's the same chip that I had replaced on the CPU board, because the CPU basically sends a signal, a 4-bit binary signal to this. So one of the 16 outputs go low, they trigger a pre-transistor, and the pre-transistor drives the main driver transistor, which grounds a solenoid. The solenoids are all normally powered off of 28 volts on one lug, but the other lug's floating. It's connected to a pin that leads to one of these transistors, and when the transistor gets activated, it pulls the output low, completing the circuit on the solenoid, and the solenoid fires. This thing wasn't working, it got replaced, and things seem to work a little bit better. It's got a relay on here to enable the flippers, so you can't keep hitting the flippers when you're not in a game. 16 of these are driven by this chip, and the rest of them, there's a few extra ones that are driven directly from data lines coming from the CPU, that just directly where the TTL signal drives one of the pre-transistors directly, and then that in turn drives the final driver transistor. And I guess that was a way, you know, they didn't have enough select lines coming out of this one, so they just cheated and added a few extra lines. I probably changed about 5 or 6 of these driver transistors, which were they were all, but actually no, they weren't all shorted. Most of them actually were open, but there was 1 or 2 of these that were shorted, and I guess somebody put in tin foil for some of the fuses at some point, because there were 3 melted solenoids, which means these things, since they were shorted, they just had the solenoids on in continuous duty, which they're not made for, and the solenoids eventually self-destructed. But anyway, everything seems to be fixed on this board, and now we'll go on to the next. Here's what happens to a coil that has a defective driver transistor. Basically, you can see that a lot of the copper turns here, I mean, were close to catching on fire if they didn't already. And the biggest part is, this is going to be kind of hard to show, but this is supposed to be just the solenoid plunger goes in here, but you can see there's some obstructions in there, and those obstructions are basically the bobbin has melted from the heat of the heat that the coil generated, and the plunger wouldn't even, I mean, the plunger couldn't travel here anymore, and obviously this thing is ruined. I had a couple more of them that were ruined by drivers that were shorted, but hopefully that is fixed. And we had the soundboard, and the procedure was very close to the procedure we used on the CPU board, since the assumption was whatever jolted the CPU jolted this guy too. And again, you see it has a lot of socketed chips, and I think on this one every single socketed chip, I mean other than the 16-pin ones, were bad. We had the 5 volts being pulled down again when this board was being powered, and I used the binary search on it again, even though I think the first one I did here immediately identified this chip as being bad, which I replaced. We got, I think it was 8 blinks out of this thing, but it still didn't work. And so after checking around some more, there were 2 more TTL chips over here that had given their life. And after that, it started to make some sound. Alright, so after replacing everything, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 blinks. Did you see? Again, it's saying I'm good, but same as with the CPU board, all of the outputs coming from this board are not looped back, so we don't know if things work correctly until we put it in the machine. And some of the cuts made, here's one. I can't find the other ones here. I made, oh, there's a bunch of messy ones. There's one over here, which also caused me problems because I forgot to reconnect it when I was done with it. And yeah, there's 1 or 2 more, but yeah, it was the same procedure as with the last time. But at least it's coming up. So try it one more time. there you go. So what time is it now? Time to put the boards back in. I've already looked at the lamp driver, and the lamp driver seems okay, but I haven't really tested it. It's just like the TTL chips on there seem to be okay when I powered it up. So I'm not going to deal with it unless it's a total disaster, but let's put the soundboard back in and see what gives. Everything's reinstalled. I secured the transformer, which of course was outside of the cabinet and was free floating. And that's an easy thing to forget, to fasten things like that down, which means it'll be okay till somebody starts wanting to move the machine and tips the head, and then the transformer basically kills everything. But yeah, the boards are all in there. So let's see. Let's see if the lights are all going to blink. Well, the post lights, and if the machine comes up. So that's promising. Of course, one thing we haven't looked at are the displays, which miraculously all survived. The only thing, the one that didn't survive, is the status display, this guy over here. But there's only 3 chips on it, and the first chip I replaced, this one, fixed it. So it's kind of funny that the jolt, the voltage transient or whatever it was, didn't reach the displays. They look very flickery on the video, but they're quite stable in real life. So let's put it into test mode and see what happens. To get the test mode, we have a little button here in the coin door, and we got to press it several times. First couple times we press it, it basically goes into an audit mode that lets you change things and tells you how many coins have been fed to it and all of that. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So 15, okay, 15 tests the controlled bulbs. Now remember, I didn't repair anything on the lamp driver board, and it seems that it's mostly working, but there are a couple of lights that don't want to work, notably these 2. And I replaced the bulbs, and they're just probably something wrong on the driver. There's some other places where you can barely see the lights come on, and that may be a bad socket. The 3 times over here doesn't work. But other than that, mostly, oh yeah, there's another 2 lights here and here. Unfortunately, you can see the playfield damage here, which is commonly referred to as this playfield sporting wood. It's just worn down so badly, and I don't have the necessary art skills to do this, and I don't have the desire to do it either. But maybe sometime later on I will conscript one of my friends who's better at this stuff than me and see if we can do anything about the playfield. But I mean, look at the wear around the pop bumpers here. And it's too bad. It can be fixed, but you know, fixing things like this is going to be difficult. But yeah, so that's the lamp test mode. The next test mode is the displays, and it just goes through all the digits, and it looks like they are all working. The next test is the solenoids. It'll just automatically step through all of the solenoids. So that seems to work. And finally there's a switch test that identifies what switches are closed. And basically it says right now nothing's closed, but as I touch switches, the switch number that I'm pressing on the playfield lights up. So all of that seems to be working. I mean, what I did on the playfield, I cleaned it up as best as I could. All of the rubber rings on it had essentially petrified. They came off in bits and pieces. So I changed the rubber rings so at least we could play. Playfield's rough. I mean, look at this. Here's this kick-out hole. And it always lands here. So if I take the ball and put it in here. Hello? Oh, it's in test mode. If you're in attract mode, it should kick the ball out, which it'll do once I exit the test. Bug. Doesn't detect the ball in there because it goes by, it looks at switch transitions, I guess. So it's in attract mode right now, and there, kicks the ball out because it's not supposed to be in there. And it's doing its thing. So for those of you who are yawning heavily and just want to get on to the next video, thanks for watching. I will play a game on this, and you really don't want to miss me playing a game on this, but I know there's a lot of you who will miss it. So again, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and be good. For those of you watching, get ready for the wild ride of your life. Here goes. This game's got a very deep rule set. Oh, come on. Well, that was a lot of work for a game that's not an A game or a B game. But it's an old game, and unlike things like old computers and stuff, they're neat to fix, but they're basically useless once you fix them, because what you got sitting on your desktop or in your laptop just is so much more useful. Whereas these pinball machines, even though not as exciting as the new multi-$1,000 ones that are coming out every day, and are licensed games and look nice and have thousands of ramps and large LCD displays and all of that, this is still playable. This is an early pinball game. It needs a certain type of skill to play it, which I most certainly did not demonstrate. But it is worth fixing these, not just to keep them alive, but you can actually play them. So for those of you who stuck around, thanks for watching again, and we will see you next time. And there she is in all her glory. I mean, this game, the best feature of this game is that it's got a really nice back glass, which is the hardest thing to replace. I mean, they do make reproduction back glasses for a lot of machines, but for popular machines. This one, I don't know if I mentioned it, but only had a production run of 400 units. And of those 400, I don't know, we can probably guess that there's still a couple hundred left out in the wild. I'm sure there's some that are in much better shape than this, but hey, it's fully working and ready to go on to the next project.